I told somebody yesterday I was going to finish the book tonight, and they laughed at me. So my goal is to get through 48 tonight. There is quite a bit of information in chapter 49, Jacob blessing all the children, so we will try to get these 3 chapters done this evening. This is Jacob's travel to Egypt in Genesis chapter 46. Now, that's your first blank there. Jacob and his family travel to Egypt. Of course, they've been promised the land already. Don't go down to Egypt yet. Well, now it's time to go to Egypt. And of course, you go back to, this goes all the way back to Abraham, back in Genesis chapter 15. God told Abraham, you're going to receive a land, but your people, your descendants, are going to be servants in a foreign land for how many years? You remember? 400 years. That's Genesis 15, verses 12 to 14. So that's the period of time that we are getting ready to enter into as we move into the book of Exodus. So anyway, Genesis 46, Israel took his journey and all that he had and came to Beersheba and offered sacrifices unto the God of his father Isaac. And God spake unto Israel in the visions of the night. And again, that's another type of communication. I know I've referenced this quite a few times in our study, but Hebrews 1, 1 and 2, God who at various times and in various ways spoke unto the fathers, has in these last days spoken unto us by His Son. We have all these different methods of communication from God to man, and this is just another example of that. I am God, the God of thy father. Fear not to go down into Egypt, for I will there make of thee a great nation. So again, it's been promised they're going to be a great nation. Well, now it's specified it's going to happen in Egypt. And that's such an interesting, we don't know exactly how much time passes transitioning from Genesis to Exodus, and there are some definitive periods of time given to us, but as I've also said many times throughout this study, we're not given a precise timeline of how long everything takes and how much time passes. But anyway, God's promise in a vision, verses 1 to 3, goes all the way back to Abraham. You're going to Egypt. So basically the rest of the chapter, from verses 5 to 27, is the record of the caravan, the traveling. And you think of the nature of travel in those days, and how long did it take? I don't know. But it would be something to see, let's just say it that way. They took, starting in verse 6 there, at the end of verse 5. Wagons, okay, their little ones, their wives, cattle, their goods, which they had gotten in the land of Canaan, and came into Egypt. Jacob and all of his descendants with him, his sons and his sons' sons with him, his daughters and his sons' daughters, and all his seed brought he with him into Egypt. Stephen, when Stephen is preaching in Jerusalem in Acts chapter 7, he basically summarizes this in Acts 7, about verses 9 to 15. And so you can also read about that there. But anyway, he begins naming the people, again, from verse 8 down through verse 25 or so, 26. And so, not a lot of comment to be made there. Verses 28 to 33, Joseph and Israel are reunited. That's your next blank here. It's been approximately 30 years. That's really something to think about, you know. Father and son separated for 30 years, and now they are finally reunited. And, just listen to the text here. Let's see. Verse 28. He sent Judah before him unto Joseph to direct his face unto Goshen, and they came into the land of Goshen. Joseph made ready his chariot and went in to meet Israel his father, fell on his neck, and wept on his neck a good while. I mean, what else would you do? What would you say? That'd be quite an emotional reunion, wouldn't it? Everything that's happened. And Israel's going to have something to say about that here when he meets Pharaoh. We'll talk about that in a little bit. So anyway, verses 28 to 33, they're reunited. Chapter 47, Israel now gets to meet Pharaoh, and of course Joseph is a higher up. in the land of Egypt, but Israel meets Pharaoh, and it seems to be an honor to be able to meet him, that is for Pharaoh to meet Israel, because this is Joseph's family. And you hear the story. Imagine hearing the story of what's happened with Joseph and the betrayal by his brothers and 30 years of separation, and now they're being reunited. We're shepherds, verse 3. And the biblical text tells us that it was a shame for Egyptians to hang out with shepherds. There's a word for that, and the name was Hyksos. I don't have a blank for that, but Hyksos, I believe. And you don't associate with those kind of people if you're an Egyptian. They need to be out in the field. And so this is an interesting meeting, and the blessing, of course, that Pharaoh gives to Joseph and to his children, his family. Verse 6 of chapter 47, the land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land make thy father and thy brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen, let them dwell there. And I just wrote in the margin of my Bible there, to me that seems providential. God is taking care of this, at this point in time, approximately 70 people that have traveled a long way. Because they're given the best of the land, now they're able to prosper, they're out of the famine, and that's exactly what happens. Again, that's the transition from Genesis 50 to Exodus chapter 21, Exodus chapter 1. Joseph brought in Jacob his father and set him before Pharaoh, and Jacob blessed Pharaoh. How old are you? This text is interesting. Verse 9. The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers and the days of their pilgrimage. Couple of things. Number one is that word pilgrimage. And, that's what they were. They were sojourners. They hadn't exactly settled any place, and now they're moving to Egypt. But I think of the way the Christians described in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11? I beseech you, therefore, as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts which war against the soul. A pilgrim is somebody who, what that word means there in 1 Peter 2:11, it's a person who is essentially like traveling through, no rights of citizenship, no property, just we're moving from here to the next place. And that's what we're doing. I think of passages like Matthew chapter 6, do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt and where thieves break in and steal, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. We're just pilgrims here. We're not here for very long, and we're moving on to the next place. Somebody read, I may come back to that. Let's get back to this, verse 9. Let me think about that for a second. So, Abraham, you go back to Genesis 25 and verse 7. Abraham, he says, the years of my pilgrimage are not equal to what my fathers lived. So, back in Genesis 25 and verse 7, Abraham dies at the age of 175. I wrote that down next to that verse because he mentions that. Then you go over to Genesis chapter 35 and verse 28. The days of Isaac were 180 years. Well, when Jacob or Israel dies, he's going to only be 100, only. Comparatively speaking, he's approximately 30 years younger than Abraham and 35 years younger than Isaac. He only lives to 147. But the way he frames that life is, few and evil have been the years of my life. Why do you think he said that? In reading the book of Genesis, tell me what you think when you hear that. That's an interesting thought. God could have told him that, couldn't he? Why didn't he? I don't know. But yeah, grief, 30 years, thinking that your son is dead, and then here he is. And not only is he alive, but he's extremely powerful and successful. And another interesting thing is, I kind of touch on it in the last paragraph here from chapter 48, but who is Joseph's mother? Who said that? Rachel. Who was Jacob's love? Rachel. And we know what Laban did. Laban deceived him and gave him Leah after 7 years of work. And, well, you work for me 7 more years and you can have Rachel too. 14 years, and if you remember going back, I don't remember what chapter it's in, but that time, as it were, was just a few days because of his love for Rachel. And so, like, in essence, from his perspective with that, let's call it bond with Rachel from the very beginning, it's like basically Joseph's his firstborn, isn't it? I mean, if things had been done the way they ought to have been done, it seems Joseph would have been his firstborn. But anyway, few and evil have been the days of the years of my life. Somebody turn over real quick and read Job 14, verses 1 and 2, please. Job 14, verses 1 and 2. How quick is life, man? How fast does it go? Those of you who are old, Sharon said it. How quickly have your years gone? Looking back, it's gone fast. And it's like the longer you live, the faster it goes, isn't it? So, man who is born of woman is full of is a few days and full of trouble, Job 14, verse 1. Well, I mean, that may be, when you think of Job, he would have every right to say something like that, but that might be a bit hyperbolic, because has every day you've ever lived as an older person, has every day been evil and just full of nothing? Well, of course not. But some of these biblical characters, they look back on some of their experiences in life at large, and it's been quick, and there's been a lot of bad stuff that's happened. And that's kind of the futility of, so many people think that the purpose of life is to be happy. That's not the purpose of life, because there can be happiness and good times and things like that, but if that's what you're living for, there are a lot of things to break that up along the way, aren't there? That'll just in a moment take every bit of happiness away. So that's not the purpose of life. It's just interesting. Genesis 47:9, Job 14:1 and 2, passages that indicate not only the brevity of life, but the fact that the world is full of evil and a lot of bad experiences can take place. There's no question about that. So. Mm. Yes, this Pharaoh does, and we don't really know who this one is. Now, we're pretty certain who we know, the Pharaoh who came in that didn't know who Joseph was. Again, in Exodus chapter 1. We'll talk about that, but this guy seemed to be pretty just, and the way he treats Joseph, Jacob and his family here, giving them the best of the land, that seems to be. And again, I think that's part of the providential working of God, because, well, he could have been a tyrant and killed them all, because they don't belong here. And they're just shepherds. They're below us. But you don't see that here. And I think all of that plays into what Joseph's going to say at the end here in chapter 50 before his death, what he says to his brothers. All right, any other thoughts on the years of Jacob's life? Okay. Joseph situates them in the land. Chapter 47, verse 11. Placed them in the land, the King James says. He nourished his father, verse 12, and his brethren, and all his father's household with bread according to their families. I look at that word nourished, and I thought about that. And your father's old and declining. You've been separated from him for 30 years, and he just thought you were dead. So how well do you think Joseph took care of his dad when he got there? I think nourish is a good word to use there. All right, so the famine gets worse, and now it's affecting Egypt. This is 47, 13 to 26. Joseph deals with the famine, so I just break it down here for you. First of all, he collects money, verses 13 to 15. Then livestock, verses 16 to 17. And then the land, verses 18 to 22. And then, your next blank, he levies a 20% tax on the produce of the land, verses 23 to 26. And I can't say this dogmatically, but it seems like kind of the introduction of feudalism, where you have the serfs who essentially work the land for the government, and the government allows you to stay on a plot of land and feed you and things like this. And it seems our economy is leaning in that type of a direction. But anyway, perhaps this is the introduction of feudalism, but it's not going to last forever. So Joseph, you go back to those dreams of Pharaoh, the 7 fat cows eaten by the 7 lean, the 7 good grains of corn, grains of wheat consumed by the 7 parched. And, well, we're seeing the results of those dreams, or those revelations that were given, interpreted by Joseph and given to Pharaoh. And so Joseph's in charge of all of this. And again, I cannot help but think that that is the providence of God. It's interesting here now. So he does all of that, the land, the cattle, the livestock, the money then, the produce. Look at chapter 47, starting in verse 20. Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field because the famine prevailed over them, and so the land became Pharaoh's. And again, to me, that's kind of the idea of feudalism and serfdom. And as for the people, he removed them to the cities, from one end of the borders of Egypt, even to the other end thereof. So now you might have a forced labor situation. Bring them all in. Let's build an empire here. Not everybody's spread out. Only the land of the priests, verse 22, he did not buy, for the priests had a portion assigned to them by Pharaoh, and did eat their portion with Pharaoh, which Pharaoh gave them, therefore they sold not their land. That's kind of interesting because think about the Israelites. So the 12 children of, well, we call them the 12 tribes of Israel. Of course, it's the 10 sons of Jacob, and then who else become 2 of the tribes? The 2 sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. What about the Levites? What did they get? They got the priesthood, but then they got cities right around Jerusalem. So it's kind of similar. This, of course, predates that, but it's a similar type of situation where they didn't receive like a large plot of land. They just had locations where they could live, and they could come in and then serve their cycle of time in the temple of God. So that's what we have there. Chapter 47, verses 27 to 31, Israel lives in Egypt for 17 years, so he's going to die at the age of 147. Now, it's interesting. So, beginning in verse 27 there, it tells us this. They had possessions therein, talking about Israel and his people, and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Well, they're in the right place for that now. He lived there 17 years. Time drew that he must die. He called unto his son Joseph. If I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Do not bury me here. This goes back to the burial plots that we've read about. I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt, and bury me in their burying place. And well, I'll do it. Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. So, by the time they leave Egypt, so again, approximately 70 people leave there, leave Beersheba, come to Egypt. By the time they leave Egypt, there were 603,550 of men, just males, over the age of 20 who were fit for battle. So that doesn't count, obviously, the women. It doesn't count any males under the age of 20. It doesn't count the children. And it doesn't count the men who are beyond the age of battle, whatever age that might have been. So if just that group of people is 600,000, imagine the total number. You know, estimates are anywhere from 1.5 to 2 million people wandering through the wilderness after the Exodus. So, for 40 years, by the way. That's quite an interesting account. Numbers 1 gives you that. Numbers chapter 1 tells you the numbers of all the tribes, and then it tells you that specific number right there, 603,550. Any questions on chapter 47 there? Okay, there's a little bit more here in chapter 48. Jacob here blesses Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's sons. So let's do this. Somebody read Genesis 48 and read verses 5. Just make it 5 and 6. Okay, so this is kind of what I was mentioning earlier. So if things had gone the way Jacob wanted them to go way back in the beginning, Rachel would have been his wife, and in essence, Joseph is his firstborn from that perspective. We know that's not how it worked out. We know Reuben's the firstborn. But what happens here, it's like Joseph's birthright is given to Ephraim and Manasseh. Somebody turn over to 1 Chronicles 5 and read verse 1 for us there, and we'll see about that. 1 Chronicles chapter 5 and verse 1. Okay. So a father had the right to, the typical arrangement is the eldest or the firstborn gets a double portion. And we see that even obviously under the law of Moses. But because of what Reuben did and Jacob's decision here now in Genesis chapter 48, this double birthright that should have, double portion that should have gone to Reuben is given to Ephraim and Manasseh. And he essentially adopts them as his own to make them part of what we call or what we know as the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's essentially what's happening here. And your next blank, the way I put it here, Joseph's two sons, he adopts Joseph's two sons as his own, and they would have equal rank among the tribes of Israel. So we read, throughout the Old Testament, and even in the New Testament, we read about the children of Israel, don't we? And when you hear that phrase, what do you typically think of when you just hear the phrase, the children of Israel? Just all of them. Just Israel, the nation. That's, again, as we're going through the book of Genesis, that's what's being narrowed down to here is how this has progressed. And but when we're at this point in time, when we're talking about the children of Israel, we're talking about Reuben and Simeon, Gad, the children that were born to Rachel and Leah and their handmaids specifically. But in time, of course, that's going to expand out to the nation that becomes like the sand that's on the sea and like the stars that are in the sky. But Ephraim and Manasseh are of equal rank now among the tribes because of Jacob's decision here. And it's also interesting, the firstborn blessing is again given to the younger son. So, and the text is very specific here. Look at, as Joseph brings his boys to Jacob. Jacob is getting old and he's about to die. Look at the specificity here. Somebody read chapter 48, verses 12 and 13. Why do you think Joseph did it that way? He put his right hand on the head of Ephraim, which would be towards his father's left hand, and his left hand on Manasseh's head, which would be towards Jacob's right hand, because they're facing each other. So it's, why do you think Joseph did that? So that Jacob could bless the kids. Why would the Bible be so specific in those two verses? To bless the firstborn, the right hand. And that language is often used in the Bible. The son of my right hand, something like he's the next in line. And so Joseph does this intentionally, and the Bible records it like that. Verse 14 says, and Israel stretched out his right hand and laid it upon the younger, Ephraim's head. So he does this and begins blessing them, and that's backwards. And Joseph notices that, doesn't he? Obviously, as you read the text, because in Joseph's mind, it's firstborn rights. And so, verse 15 and 16, he blessed Joseph and said, God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac did walk, the God which fed me all my life long unto this day, the angel which redeemed me from all evil, bless the lads, and my name be named among them, and the name of my fathers Abraham and Isaac. Let them grow into a multitude. Joseph saw this, and the text says it displeased him. It bothered him. The marginal reading there for the word displeased in my Bible says this was evil in his eyes. You don't do this. But Jacob is the patriarch, and he makes this decision. And he held up his father's hand to remove it from Ephraim's head unto Manasseh's. And no, don't do that. He said, I know which is which. This is the way it's going to be. And so, in your outline here, Ephraim, the name Ephraim, and you can look this up. I pulled out my concordance to look at this just to see how often this was done. The word or name Ephraim is often used as another name for the northern 10 tribes of Israel. That's your last blank there. After the kingdom splits, after Solomon dies, Rehoboam becomes king of the southern 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Jeroboam becomes the king of the northern kingdom, the 10 tribes. And throughout Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Hosea, Obadiah, and Zechariah, I put those in there for you, the nation of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, are spoken of as Ephraim. What is the southern tribe always called, typically always called? Judah. Yeah, so you've got Ephraim or Israel, and you've got Judah. The capital of the northern was, anybody remember the capital of the northern kingdom? Samaria. Capital of the southern kingdom? Jerusalem. So, this is kind of the beginning of that. The children of Israel are going to be known as, throughout your prophets, the Ephraimites, the children of Ephraim. And it's because of the decision that Jacob makes here to bless the younger. Where else do we see that happening? The firstborn blessing given to the younger. Jacob and Esau. See, and we got a few minutes. Turn over to Romans chapter 9 real quick. We don't have these practices in our culture, so far as I know. If you have a multitude of sons, you don't give a double inheritance to the oldest boy, and I don't think we have a good grasp on this culture, obviously the way they would fully understand it, but in Romans chapter 9, really chapters 9, 10, and 11, Paul discusses the problems that exist between the Jews and the Gentiles in the church at Rome. The Jews are prejudiced. There's no question about it. If you're not a Jew, if you're not circumcised and keep the law of Moses, you can't even go to heaven. That's what Acts chapter 15 is all about. So they're very proud of their heritage. Paul's trying to correct that here, that, listen, you're all on equal footing before God. That's kind of the main purpose of the book of Romans. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And he's talking specifically Jew and Gentile. There's no difference. All right? Look at Romans 9 here. Paul talks about his brethren according to the flesh, verse 3, who are the Israelites, to whom pertain the adoption. So when you read about the adoption in your New Testament, being adopted, that's a Jewish reference, a reference to God using the Jewish people. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I've mentioned that before. A lot of our foreign policy is based on that idea that Israel is still God's chosen people. So the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the services of God, the promises, all of this according to the flesh, that's where Christ came from. And that's really the basis of that promise going all the way back to Genesis chapter 12. That's why, again, when I advertise what we're going to do on Wednesday nights on Facebook, it's Genesis, the foundation of Scripture. And that's literally what it is. I mean, again, as I've said a few times, it starts out very broad, the creation, Adam and Eve, sin. But it slowly necks down to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the children of Israel. So anyway, you keep reading through Romans chapter 9, verse 8, for instance. The children of the promise, verse 9. This is the word of promise. Verse 11, when talking about the choosing between Jacob and Esau. The children not yet being born, not having done any good or evil, that the purpose of God according to election might stand. God chose Jacob when they were still in the womb, didn't He? Genesis 25. What did he say specifically to Rebekah? You remember, 2 whats are in your womb? You remember the word? 2 nations are in your womb. It wasn't about the boys as individuals. And that's where so many people miss this, particularly those who believe in Calvinism and election and predestination. It has nothing to do, God's choosing of Jacob over Esau had nothing to do with Jacob going to heaven and Esau going to hell. It had to do with, I'm going to use Jacob and his children to bring about the Christ. So you follow these words through Romans 9. Again, verse 8, promise. Verse 9, promise. Verse 11, the purpose of God might be accomplished. He had a will, and He chose how He was going to do it. And one of the questions is, look down at verse 14. Was God unrighteous for doing that? Was He wrong for choosing Jacob to carry out His purpose? What's it say? Certainly not. Of course not. He had every right to choose whomever He wanted to choose. And so it goes on through, and again, all the way through chapter 11. But then He, of course, includes the call of the Gentiles into the kingdom, which, of course, in this day is the church. But that's what Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11 is about. And that all men, Jewish and non-Jewish, are equal before God. And God had a purpose, and He had made promises. And He maintained His purpose, and He kept His promises. And He didn't do anything wrong. So, anyway, any thoughts or questions on any of that? Yes. Yes. Jews today are still looking for the Messiah. Yes. This was interesting. I got a 10-page letter the other day. We're going through it in our young adults class. That for 2 pages, the person tried to prove by my last name that I'm a lost sheep of the house of Israel. They traced Odell through Celtic origins, and could I be one of the lost sheep? No. That was all destroyed in AD 70 when the temple was burned to the ground. All those records were destroyed. And yet people still hang on to that stuff that actually the New Testament forbids us from doing. Yeah. One person says all of God's promises to the Jews were fulfilled. A good verse for that is Joshua 21, verses 43 to 45. Not one good thing that God promised to the children of Israel failed. All came to pass. What does that mean? If nothing failed and all came to pass, there's nothing left to give them. There's no land for them. They are not His people anymore. And that's, again, that's kind of what Paul's doing here in Romans chapters 9, 10, and 11. But to get back to Genesis, that kind of, I mean, it doesn't start here in Genesis 48, but Ephraim, you go Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, skips Joseph, blessing goes to Ephraim. Ephraim becomes Israel.